Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. The podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. On the Good Faith Podcast, we often make sense of the world in terms of larger issues that affect us, such as issues in our culture or politics. But as important as those issues are, for many of us, our worlds are not just shaped by these issues out there, but also by the individuals closest to us. And at this more intimate and individual level, I've been interested in this question. How is our sense of the world affected when one of those intimate individuals in our life is disabled? The question of how the disabled shape us is worth pondering because many of us will face this question inevitably or have already faced it, particularly as we care for parents who inevitably become more and more disabled as they age. This topic of disability is explored by the New York Times bestselling author Kathleen Norris in her latest book, Rebecca Sue, A Sister's Reflection on Disability, Faith, and Love. In addition to Rebecca Sue, Kathleen is noted for books such as The Cloister Walk, Dakota, A Spiritual Geography, and Amazing Grace, A Vocabulary of Faith. So Kathleen Norris, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So Kathleen, your book is all about your sister, and we'll talk more about who she was and what she went through. But if you had to just give a few sentences of introducing your sister to somebody who doesn't know her, what would you say?
I'd say you're going to meet a person with a lively personality, a great sense of humor, who did not let her disabilities define her.
All right. Well, and what was her disability?
She was born with what they call perinatal hypoxia, which means not getting enough oxygen at a critical time in the birth canal. And she was aware that this happened to her. So she lived with that burden of knowing that basically medical mistakes had caused this. So it was a lot.
Well, I think that's really important how aware she was. And I'm using past tense because she passed away. One of our big themes, our defining theme of the Good Faith Podcast is we're trying to help people make sense of the world and the world that they inhabit. So, describe how Rebecca did this. How did she, and one of the, I think, beautiful things about your book is you include a lot of her own words in the book, right? So sort of describe then, how did she make sense of what happened to her, her journey through life? How did she make sense of the world?
Well, one of the great gifts that I had when I was writing this book is that I had so many of her words because she loved to write letters. And so I had her letters to me, her letters to my parents letters to her. I had this vast family correspondence to draw from because I never want to write a memoir where I'm the only one speaking. I always want to include other voices. And Becky had a strong voice, as we'll see. But like when she was a toddler, my parents were educators, and they knew that Becky was not developing the way my older brother, and myself had developed. They knew there were problems. Becky never learned to crawl. The coordination required between the mind and the body was just too much for her. So she started scooting around the house like a little rocket ship. She could scoot faster than anyone you ever saw. So she learned how to do things a different way. And I think that served her well in a lot of different areas of life.
But you said she was aware of the kind of tragedy that happened to her. How did she wrestle with that? How did she make sense of that? Because it's just, I think if for me, I'd be like, the world sucks. The world is terrible and an unfair place. How did she do it?
She did refer to it in some of her journals over the years and some of her letters. Why did this happen to me? That sort of question, I think it always did haunt her. But I think growing up in our family where she was loved unconditionally, she knew she was safe there. She had people who loved her dearly. I think that really helped her to overcome the anger, everything. She dealt with anger a lot, but I think that helped her overcome that sense of tragedy.
You say that she overcame her anger. It sounds like that. I mean, at least from reading the book, I would say it sounds like that took a long time. It was a journey. It was a process.
Yeah, I never thought that she would evolve beyond the boy crazy stage of about 15, She was the perfect person for advertisers, that trying to convince her that if she used the right shampoo or the right toothpaste, she would attract a handsome guy. I mean, my sister for years was in that category. She really believed those things. And the anger was there partly because she knew what had happened to her. She was treated very badly as a child in school. She called stupid and slow and retarded and all these things. So she had a lot of anger to deal with. But one of the joys of writing this book and spending her last years with her was that she really underwent a transformation from someone who was angry all the time, from somebody whose main attitude was gratitude. She thanked people for doing things for her. She was grateful to cancer center nurses and enjoyed. She's the only person I've ever known who, when she went for her chemo treatments, she was like going to a party because she got to see all her new friends. I mean, she had an extraordinary way of adapting. But growing up with her was really tricky, though, because one of the stories I tell, and she'd love to tell this story about herself when she was older. When I was about 14, I got my first lipstick, and I just thought that was the coolest thing. Well, Becky was younger, and she was jealous that I had this. I found her one day writing with that lipstick on a cinder block wall. And, of course, I yelled at her, and she just turned and looked at me and said, "You can't hit me. I'm retarded." So she could use her disability when it was to her advantage to do that. And we all had to figure out what she needed to be held accountable for. In that case, she knew what she was doing was wrong. But there were other times when she did things because she couldn't help it. And it was always a struggle for my parents, my brother, myself, for all of us to sort of figure those things out and help her navigate through all that.
Well, it certainly comes out in your book about how Rebecca Sue went through this spiritual journey from somebody who was difficult and would maybe manipulate or use her disability in ways that weren't fair, to somebody who was deeply grateful in some really profound ways. So that's the spiritual journey, and there were other parts of it, but that's a big arc of her spiritual journey. How did observing and participating in her journey affect you?
Well, I think I learned what to do if I ever have to get treated for cancer, to treat all the people there, the receptionists, the nurses, the doctors, as friends who are trying to help me, and not to be afraid, but to enjoy their company and engage them in conversation, all these things that my sister did. I mean, I've learned that that's a way you can be in the world. You don't have to be afraid. You don't have to be angry all the time. You really can overcome that.
Wow, that's a hard and true and needed lesson for all of us to learn. You've said that this book is, and I quote, "a love letter and a lament." Can you connect the dots between those two words, love and lament? Why do they go together?
Well, it's a love letter because I want people to meet my sister. And she really was an extraordinary person who had a difficult life. And my father said in one of his letters to me, we learn a lot about love from her. And I think I want people to take that away, that from this, that you can learn a lot about love and a number of things from a person like my sister, that it's so easy to dismiss disabled people as if they're not fully human or they're not real people to take into consideration. So there's that. And there's also the lament. One of the things that has haunted me for a long time is that sense that I thought Becky was really meant to be the writer in the family. She has a real gift for writing, and she never was able to do much with that. It's in her letters, it's in her journals. And I think that was one reason that she was very jealous of me when my books started becoming popular and everything. I think she sensed that. She might have wanted to be a writer. So there is that sense of lament. Can I read the letter she wrote me when Dakota was published? Because I think it shows exactly how she, the kind of letter that she wrote. She wrote,
please, go ahead.
"Dear Kathy, I feel hurt because you wrote a book and I didn't. Happy for you, and I tried to read your book and I was bored with it. Mom and Dad and everybody talking about it. I feel left out, but it will pass. Hope you understand how I feel about your book. I'm telling you how I feel and starting to cry while I write this letter."
Hmm.
So she had a gift for writing and for being totally open and honest, not hiding the bad things that most of us learn, how to filter out when we're engaging with people. She didn't have that, and she wrote. And so the honesty was always wonderful to see and to deal with. I remember one time I met her handyman at the movie. She loved going to movies, and I loved taking her to movies, even though I had to sit through some pretty bad ones with her. But and I met her handyman, and I said, "Oh, Becky, I have something to tell you. It's really important, something that had happened to me." She said, "No, I go first. My story is more important than yours." And I knew not to laugh. I knew she meant it. And I think the story was probably a story I'd heard a million times over about a roommate in a group home or something that was annoying. But she would just come out and say the things that most adults would filter out. And it was just wonderful to be with a person who does that. And it leads me to think, well, how much do I filter out? How much can I say that won't hurt people, but would be more honest? Those kinds of things. She put me on the spot.
Well, that's really, I think that's really profound, this kind of unflinchingly honest sort of reaction and comment on the world. It strikes me that that's how we are called to be in the world, is this combination of love and lament. And they are really related, because what and who we love in the world is going to cause a sense of heartbreak and tragedy in our life, in most cases, I think. And so to love the world, to love people in the world that are close to us, is also to lament the world and to lament what has happened to them. So I
To love
really like
flawed
that.
people and recognize the flaws in ourselves as we do that. And I think Becky called that forth in me as well, I think.
I want to talk about the honesty that you depict Rebecca with. And my wife asked me when she saw me read the book, like, "Oh, what's that book like?" And the two words I use to describe it is unflinchingly honest. And the unflinching part of it is because in your honest depiction of her, you include some very difficult details about her own behavior, but also how others mistreated her. And there are some parts that are, just to be honest, and maybe just to warn our audience, like they're challenging to read through because of just how painful, again, both her behavior and how others behave towards her. And I remember reading some parts of it thinking, gosh, I don't know if I want somebody to write that about me if that were true in my life. So I'm super curious, like, how did you decide what to include in it, include in this book? Because I'm sure you didn't include everything, but you included a lot. Like, what was your internal process as an author in making those
I
decisions?
included a lot, and I included stories that other family members gave me too about Becky, because yeah, she could lie and be very deceptive sometimes. When she was in her 30s and she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, that led to the quest that I think most of us are on. We want to find our soulmate. We want to find someone we can spend our lives with. Well, with Becky, because of that bipolar disorder, that turned into some real recklessness in terms of sexuality and doing things that were just dangerous. Having sex with people that she just met. It's a miracle to me that she survived that. But again, I believe in redemption, and I think sometimes telling those stories and then showing what ended up happening, the person she ended up becoming, that's a valuable thing to share with people. And I don't think my family, my parents are deceased, but my brother and my sister read the book. My nieces and nephew, who grew up with Becky in a 3-generation household, they knew her when they were children. They read the book, and none of them objected to having those stories told. They thought it was important to include them, and so you get a real picture of a real person.
Yeah. Your book obviously is a kind of ongoing reflection on many topics, but especially disability. I mean, the subtitle of your book is A Sister's Reflections on Disability, Faith, and Love. And it struck me while reading it that maybe not everyone can immediately identify with disability, because when they think of disability, they think of, somebody like Rebecca, either from birth or, some acquired obvious disability. But then I suddenly realized, you know what? I think almost all of us are going to face disability when we experience the ongoing process of aging and eventual death of our parent, because they will be going through a ongoing process of disability. And as we come into contact with that process, we're going to come into contact with what it means to face and wrestle with disability. So, I want you to ask, like, what lessons does your book hold for anyone who is beginning to care for someone disabled, whether it's their parent or somebody else?
Well, I have a little reflection about caregiving towards the end of the book, because I never thought of myself as ever being a good caregiver, but I ended up doing a lot of caregiving for my husband and some for both of my parents and quite a bit for Becky. And I think I learned a lot of lessons doing that. And some of that is in the book, that spending time with that person is so precious. Even if it means sitting outside the hospital waiting 45 minutes for the handyman, you're with this person. You're engaging in conversation. It's precious time it's the best use of your time, because it's precious time that once they're gone, you won't have them there. And I learned that especially very much with my husband. For the last year of his life, my first job in the morning was cleaning out his bedside commode, which is it's not the nicest job in the world, but it meant that at least some of his systems were still working fine. He was alive. I could spend the day with him. It's really important. And for caregivers, your patience gets worn thin, and you do need to find respite care or something you can do. I found a wonderful water aerobics class that took a lot of the tension out. Just exercise, walking, doing some things for yourself is necessary. But it's a kind of patience that I actually think it's a kind of patience that God has with us, that God is never going to lose patience with us flawed creatures who do all kinds of stupid things. And I think sitting there doing stupid things with my sister, okay, this is precious time. This is good time. And it took me a while to sort of realize that, but that really is what caregiving involves. And that's why people really try to evade it, avoid it, or they're afraid of it. But I think once you enter into caregiving, you begin to understand that it's a joy, a difficult joy, but a joy.
That's very profound and challenging. Kathleen, you're a writer, and so you've written many books. So it makes sense to me how, as you are trying to, make sense of your sister's life, you would write a book. But not everyone is going to write a book. Very few of us are going to write a book. And so I wanted to sort of talk with you about the process of making sense of someone's life as they go through disability and death, as your sister went through here. I think there's just sort of this, for many of us, a desire to make sense of their life, especially near the end of their life, right? And now for me, a key part of my own process in making sense of my dad's life, when he passed away several years ago, was I was called upon to give the eulogy. And the process of writing and delivering the eulogy was sort of my own sense of sense making. And I remember as I was composing it, just, finally breaking down in tears. Like, I had not been able to mourn his death in any very felt emotional ways, but it was actually in composing and writing that eulogy that sort of unlocked the grief in me. So I wanted to ask you, for people who are not going to write a book about, say, their loved one's death, and maybe not even going to give the eulogy, what would you recommend as sense-making activities that can unlock some of the meaning, the deep meaning that people hold within them?
Well, I'm not surprised that writing a eulogy would elicit tears and actually help you in the grieving process. It would take you a step further, because I certainly had a lot of tears when I was writing this book. In fact, the very first section I wrote, that little tiny thing about taking my sister to a Beach Boys concert, that was actually the first piece I wrote. And I really didn't know how I was going to proceed with the book, but I had that memory. And the minute I finished it, I broke down sobbing. And I went, oh dear, if the Beach Boys can do this to me, what's coming next? I mean, this is going to be a challenge. So I knew that. And I think one thing people can do, I mean, writing is how I do make sense of the world. But I think people can write eulogies, even if they'll never be delivered. They can write letters to people who their beloved deceased family members. They can write letters to them, whether they're present or not present. They can certainly take time to slow down and consider the meaning of their life in connection with this person. That just, well, they might keep a journal or a diary, but even if they don't do that, they can take the time to reflect. And that's something that's so precious in our world, and we're kind of losing our ability to do that because we're so distracted now by all kinds of things with the internet and with the pace of life. So it's harder to do that, but I think paying attention to your own life and to your life in relation to others is really, really important. And anybody can do that. It just takes a little concentration, deliberation, and some time.
Kathleen, last year we had on this podcast Amy Julia Becker, who I see wrote a blurb for your book. And on that episode, and we'll put the link in the show notes, but on that episode, Amy Julia talked beautifully about her own spiritual journey in caring for her daughter who has Down syndrome. So I was reading your book and thinking about Amy Julia's book. And I was thinking about what it takes to access that kind of love, care, sacrifice for someone else as they're going through the disability. And I was thinking, well, for Amy Julia, she's doing that. She's accessing those inner spiritual resources for her child. And it doesn't, mean that her process wasn't hard or wasn't, very self-sacrificial. But I thought, I can at least sort of imagine that. I mean, I actually have a daughter who has a disability, which is not nearly anything as severe as what Rebecca Sue did, but it's meaningfully affects her life. It causes a great deal of lament in my own life. But I was thinking, well, I can access those in caring for her because I think there's no other stronger power force in the universe than a parent's love for their child, right? And then I also thought, as I was reflecting on, sort of my journey with, responding to my dad's death, I wasn't the primary caregiver, but, I do think that caring for our parents also is something that we can access with something that feels very powerful because most of us have some, very innate sense of appreciation and gratitude for the people who gave us life, our parents, right? But your story is a story of caring for your sister. And I suddenly thought, now siblings are more tricky and complicated. And in fact, you tell the story that one of your other sisters had a very complicated relationship, Charlotte, right? Had a very complicated relationship with their siblings. So, there are many of us who, are going to be called to care for siblings. And I think that is a particularly complicated relationship and process. So I wanted to ask you, again, given that your subtitle to your book is A Sister's Reflections on Disability, Faith and Love, explain what is it about being sisters or being siblings that's just true in this process of caring for a disabled person?
Well, I think one of the things I have my wonderful parents. I have an older brother, and then myself, and then Becky, and then my younger sister named Charlotte. And we all knew that our parents were the ground of our life. They loved us unconditionally. We had that foundation. And of course, we also had sibling rivalries, and we had the usual squabbles that kids get into. My brother and I, being older, we were very well aware that we needed to be protective of Becky. She was pretty accident prone as a child because she didn't have common sense sometimes. So we had that added on there. But if we wanted to argue about stuff and be stupid, I mean, we just went into it. We knew we didn't want to do damage to Becky, insult her in ways that would be harmful or hit her, anything like that. But we certainly had squabbles. But Becky was brilliant in some ways because, that letter I wrote, she was so jealous when my first book, Dakota, got all kinds of attention. And what she finally decided to do with it was to issue me a call. And she said, "You should write a book about me so I can be famous like you." That's a brilliant way of dealing with her jealousy. And at the time, I was thinking that would be a great idea. I had no idea how I would ever do such a thing. But I said, "Becky, I will try. I think that's a good idea." But that was how she dealt with the jealousy in a really brilliant way.
Kathleen, what was the time span between when Rebecca Sue passed away and when you began the book?
Well, I think I wanted to write the book, but it took me about 2 years to finally get to sitting down and actually starting to tell some stories. And then I worked on that for a number of years. That would have been 2 years after Becky died. And then I worked on it for a while, and I finally sent 300 pages to people I'd worked with for years, and they both rejected it. The agent and an editor, they just weren't interested at all, which was really crushing. I mean, writers get used to rejection, but this felt bad because this was a book I knew I needed to write, and I had to figure out how to do it. And so it sat in limbo for quite a while. I would look at it and be discouraged and go on to do something else. And then sometimes about 3 a.m, it was like the manuscript was waking me up saying, "Are you ever going to get back to this? You need to do it." And sometimes I wonder if that was my guardian angel poking me that way. And so it took a long time. It took about 10 years to finally, I said, "I'm just too old to wait around any longer. I'm going to try to get this manuscript into shape and find a new agent, a new editor." And that's what I did.
When I was reading the book, I was thinking, in so many ways, Rebecca Sue is something between, or flips between being the hero and the anti-hero of her story, given what, because her behavior is, many times you describe it, I wouldn't describe it heroic at all. And then yet at the end, there is sort of something heroic spiritually. But there's another character that I feel is a almost clear, unalloyed hero in the book, which is your father. And because there's so many stories of what I think are just heroic efforts by your father to care for Rebecca in some very challenging and difficult situations. But there were times also when I was, deep in admiration for what your father did. But the question also cropped up: is this too much? I mean, just is he crossing some boundaries that we just need to have when we care for another, or otherwise we just exhaust ourselves, or it's just, this isn't even good for the situation or for the person. So I want to ask you, since you've wrestled with this so much, how do caregivers discern where that line is between, heroic, loving acts of care and going too far?
Well, I think the word "too much" would apply to my father in a lot of different areas. And so for him, he willing to go the extra mile always for people, for even strangers, if he was just amazing that way. And I think with my sister, he felt kind of guilty because he felt like if they had chosen another hospital, this might not have happened to her. So there was some guilt there. There was fear because of what had happened to one of his sisters, who became probably schizophrenic, but maybe bipolar too, and killed herself when she was she was diagnosed around the time Becky was in her 30s, and she died not long after that. And so he was haunted by that fear. But I think, and I think my mom was a good balance there. When my dad would be too much and try to go too far in being overprotective of Becky and all of that, my mom could kind of rein him in. And I thought it was really great when my sister did have some social workers assigned to her for various reasons. And when she was in her 20s, one of them finally said, "You have to let her move out of the home. She will never grow up unless she learns how to live with other people." And that was really hard for my dad to accept. I think my mother was more practical about that. So Becky moved into group homes. And of course, we always kept in touch with the group home owners. And Becky came to every family party. She was still with our family a great deal. She never felt abandoned or neglected. But she had to learn how to get along with other people who would not be as indulgent as her siblings and her parents. So that was a lesson for her, but it was a lesson, I think, for my parents also, a lesson to kind of step back. But one of the extraordinary things my dad did, he was a musician, and his day job was directing Navy bands in Washington, D.C. when I was born, and then in Chicago, and then at Pearl Harbor. But when he retired from the Navy, because of his experiences with my sister, he went back to the University of Hawaii and got a degree so he could teach special ed. And he taught special ed until he was almost 70 years old, because he thought that, what he'd learned about disabilities, from my sister, he wanted to help however he could. And he made some friends with some of the families and some of these young students that he was working with. So he was just a dedicated guy, and too much is a good description of my dad just in general.
Shifting gears here, Kathleen, you reference, I can't remember if this is in the book or in interviews you've given, but you reference the concept of a holy fool. And I was really struck by that term and the pairing together of the term holy and fool. Can you explain what you mean by that term?
Well, it's very much in the Christian tradition, of the juggler who is, there's all kinds of films and stories about the holy fool who reveals the truth about things in ways that people who are considered sane often try to smooth over. The holy fool is the person who lacks the filter and will come out and say the things that no one else is willing to say. The emperor's new clothes is a perfect example of the holy fool. The emperor isn't wearing any clothes. The holy fool is the only one who's willing to say that, but it's the absolute truth.
Well, I think the connection for me is that it seems like the holy fool is somebody who is dismissed by society at large, but like you said, nevertheless reveals truths that need to be grappled with. And so I guess my question is, was Rebecca Sue something of a holy fool? And if so, what truths did she reveal about the world?
Well, it could be. And I think the fact that she would state the truth, state the things that no one else was willing to say, innocently, not knowing that other people might think this was odd or I think that's one of the gifts that she offered. And one of the things that I used to love when going out to a restaurant these days, most waiters will come up and say, well, would you like a cocktail before dinner? And Becky would just look at them and say, no, it would interfere with my psych meds. Boom. There it is, she's telling the truth. And it's a little just that waiters, okay, they might want to keep their distance there, but it was just matter of fact for her.
So let's shift from the sort of personal level to the systemic level, and kind of what truths that we as a society need to come to terms with, and how, especially from, sort of knowing somebody like Rebecca Sue. Because, and I thought about this in terms of how your book describes the many different ways that Rebecca interacted with systems, medical systems, social service systems, church systems. What would you like to see in all of those systems? What would you like to see changed in how they respond to someone like Rebecca?
I think listening, regarding a disabled person as a full person, a real person, someone who may or may not be able to answer your questions, but at least try. And I think Becky would, when she was meeting a doctor for the first time, she would say, I am special needs. She liked that word special. I'm special needs. And that was important for them to know. And just the fact that if they would listen to her and let her speak for herself meant a great deal to me. I was often with her in her later years going to doctors, and I would insist that they ask Becky if a medical decision was going to be made. It was her choice. And the good doctors listened and did that. I tell some stories about really some remarkable encounters that she had with medical professionals, that they understood that Becky was smart in some ways and very limited in others, and they dealt with it. And that was really, it was beautiful to watch that happen, that they could do that. But yeah, some of the social workers, I was horrified one time when she got a new social worker who was very young, very new, and fresh on the job. And she found out that the source of Becky's disability, the fact that she had perinatal hypoxia when she was born, had somehow been missed from the records. It had been dropped from the records over the years. So social workers were dealing with someone they just thought was crazy for maybe no good reason. And that just horrified me. It horrified this young social worker too. So I said, no, you have to put that in there. And I had the dates, I had the name of the hospital, everything I could give them to correct that record. So I think, doing diligence about keeping the important records there for someone like my sister is really important. And if people are burned out and they don't really care, letting those things slide can do real damage. We found this in time so that I don't think it damaged my sister too much, but that was scary for me.
It strikes me that of all the systems that, interact with a disabled person, certainly as you described, medical systems and social service systems could do much better. But at least there's a category in medicine and in social systems for disability. I think when I think of church systems, that's where there cannot even really be a category of response. And so I really loved reading about, how especially some of is it Father Michael at the end, who does a great job, I think it sounds like. But talk more, because you've been in many churches and church systems. What do churches need to learn to do in caring for the disabled?
Well, I think asking people what they need instead of assuming that that's always important with a lot of different areas of life. But I think just understand that disabled people, they often might understand what they need from you more than you know, in asking them. What would you like to see here? What would make it easier for you to come to church and enjoy the experience?
Kathleen, this is my last question. I'd love for you to connect the dots in all of your works. This is one of the things I'm always super curious about a longtime author who's written multiple books, is trying to connect the dots between their different books. And could you do that? Especially for fans of your past books, like for instance, you write about, you're known for writing about the Benedictines, and as you wrote about in the Cloister Walk. Is there a dot there? Are those dots connected?
Oh, yeah, between those two books, but I think between some of the later books too. With Dakota, I'm writing about an area that most people in the country don't know or care about. Business people call it flyover country because you fly over the Dakotas. Yeah. No one stops there. So I'm writing about people who are hidden in plain view. They're ranchers, cowboys, Native Americans, monks, and poets living out in western South Dakota. In the second book, The Cloister Walk, I'm also writing about the people I met out there who are hiding in plain view. Benedictine monasteries are everywhere, all over the world, but nobody sees them. So I'm bringing to light stories about these people, these wonderful people that I've met, and I want people to realize who they are, what they do, how they live this extraordinary life of faith, and, my encounters with them. And I think in a way, this book is reflective of that too, because people with disabilities are often hidden in plain sight as well. So I think that's one of the themes that kind of has emerged for me, that's something I'd like to do, take something that most people aren't aware of and bring it to their attention.
Well, that's beautiful. And that is a gift to the world, to have somebody so honestly and artfully bring what is hidden into the view. Thank you for doing that in this latest book called Rebecca Sue, A Sister's Reflections on Disability, Faith, and Love. Kathleen Norris, thank you so much for coming on the Good Faith Podcast.
Well, thank you. It's been a joy.